It started as an ordinary afternoon in a small but stylish cafe tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop on a busy downtown street, the kind of place where soft jazz played low and people came to forget the outside world for a while, and Emma believed she was safe there, wrapped in the comfort of routine, holding a warm mug between her palms as rain tapped lightly against the window, her mind finally calm after months of rebuilding her life piece by piece, unaware that the past she had run from was about to walk straight through the door, because when the bell above the entrance rang sharply, her body reacted before her mind did, her shoulders stiffening as she looked up and saw Ryan standing there, her violent ex, his presence sucking the air out of the room like a sudden storm, his jaw tight, eyes burning with the kind of anger she knew too well, the kind that had once controlled her life, and she told herself not to panic, not to let him see fear, but her heart betrayed her, pounding so loudly she swore others could hear it as he crossed the cafe with long, aggressive strides, ignoring the stares of strangers, until he stopped right at her table, towering over her like he owned the space, and when she quietly told him to leave, her voice shaking but firm, something snapped inside him, his lips curling into a cruel smile as he accused her of humiliating him, of leaving him, for nothing, his words sharp enough to cut, drawing attention from nearby customers who froze mid-sip, sensing danger, and Emma stood up, refusing to sit while he loomed over her, telling him again to go before things got worse, but Ryan never listened, he never had, and in one sudden, shocking movement, he raised his hand and slapped her hard across the face, the sound cracking through the cafe like a gunshot, silencing the music, silencing conversations, leaving only the stunned gasp of onlookers and the sharp sting burning across Emma's cheek as she stumbled back against the chair, tears springing to her eyes not just from pain but from humiliation, from the horrible realization that no matter how far she ran, he still believed he owned her, and for a split second, no one moved, fear gluing people to their seats, until a man sitting at the far corner slowly stood up, tall, calm, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that didn't quite fit the casual cafe setting, his movements deliberate, controlled, as if he had all the time in the world, and when he turned, his eyes locked onto Ryan with a cold intensity that sent a ripple through the room, because this wasn't just any man, this was Luca Moretti, though most people there didn't know his name, they only felt the weight of his presence, the way the air seemed to shift when he took a single step forward, and Emma noticed him then, noticed how he placed his coffee down carefully, as if violence were something he chose only when necessary, and he walked toward them without raising his voice, without rushing, yet every step carried authority, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low but clear, cutting through the tension like a blade, telling Ryan to step away from the woman, and Ryan laughed, a short, arrogant sound, turning toward Luca with a sneer, asking who he thought he was, making the mistake of stepping closer, invading Luca's space the way bullies always do, and Luca didn't flinch, didn't blink, he simply tilted his head slightly and said, very calmly, that nobody touches what's his, the words simple, but the meaning behind them heavy, dangerous, and the room went completely still, because even those who didn't know Luca felt it, the kind of power that doesn't need to shout, and Emma's breath caught, confusion mixing with fear, because she didn't belong to anyone, not anymore, yet something about the way Luca said it made her feel protected in a way she hadn't felt in years, and Ryan scoffed again, but this time there was hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of doubt as Luca's gaze never left him, and when Ryan tried to argue, tried to justify himself, Luca raised one hand slightly, not in threat but in finality, and told him this was his last warning, that the next move would end very badly for him, and for the first time since walking in, Ryan looked around, realizing every eye was on him, realizing the staff had frozen, realizing he was no longer in control, and something about Luca's calm certainty made him step back, muttering insults under his breath before storming toward the door, the bell ringing again as he disappeared into the rain, leaving behind a shaken silence, and only then did Luca turn to Emma, his expression softening just a fraction as he asked if she was hurt, his voice losing its edge, and Emma nodded slowly, still in shock, her hand trembling as she touched her cheek, unsure whether to thank him or ask who he was, because deep down, she sensed that this moment, this interruption, wasn't just a rescue, it was the beginning of something far more dangerous, far more complicated, as Luca gently guided her back to her seat and told her to sit, that everything was over now, while outside, rain continued to fall, washing the street clean, unaware that two lives had just collided in a way neither of them could escape. The cafe slowly returned to life after Ryan left, chairs scraping softly, whispers spreading like ripples in water, but for Emma everything felt distant, muffled, as if she were watching the world from behind glass, her cheeks still burning, her hands trembling despite her effort to steady them, and Luca noticed every detail, the way she avoided eye contact, the way her shoulders stayed tense even after the threat was gone, so he stayed close without crowding her, giving quiet instructions to the barista to bring water and a clean napkin, his tone polite yet unarguable, the kind of voice people obey without realizing why, and when he handed Emma the napkin, his fingers barely brushed hers, careful, respectful, a contrast so sharp to Ryan's violence that it made her throat tighten, and she whispered a soft thank you, embarrassed by how small her voice sounded, but Luca shook his head slightly, telling her there was nothing to thank him for, that no one deserved to be treated that way, and those simple words, spoken without drama, nearly broke her, because Ryan had spent years convincing her that she deserved everything he did, and as she dabbed her cheek, Luca asked if she wanted him to call someone or walk her home, and Emma hesitated, instinctively wanting to say no, to prove she was independent, but the image of Ryan's face twisted with rage flashed in her mind, and she admitted she didn't feel safe yet, and Luca nodded as if he expected that answer, pulling out his phone and sending a brief message without explanation, then slipping it back into his pocket as he told her he'd make sure she got home safely, and something about the certainty in his voice made her believe him, even as questions crowded her mind, because who was this man who stepped into danger without hesitation, who spoke with authority but showed such restraint, and when they finally left the cafe together, the rain had slowed to a mist, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement, and Emma felt painfully aware of every step beside him, his presence grounding yet intimidating, and as they walked, Luca kept his attention outward, scanning the street calmly, not paranoid but alert, and Emma realized he moved like someone used to responsibility, used to watching over things, and she found herself telling him small truths without meaning to, that Ryan had been abusive for years, that she left with nothing but a suitcase, that she'd changed jobs and neighborhoods to disappear, and Luca listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening just slightly when she mentioned the slap, and when she finished, he told her she did the right thing by leaving, that surviving wasn't weakness, and the sincerity in his words warmed her more than the coat she pulled tighter around herself, and when they reached her apartment building, a modest place she'd chosen for anonymity rather than comfort, Emma paused, unsure how to end this unexpected connection, but Luca spoke first, telling her he'd like to check on her tomorrow, to make sure Ryan didn't come back, and Emma almost laughed at the idea of someone caring enough to check, but she nodded, giving him her number before she could overthink it, and as she turned to go inside, she felt his eyes on her, not possessive, not predatory, but protective, and that scared her almost as much as it comforted her, because protection had always come with a price before, and that night, sleep didn't come easily, her dreams filled with the echo of the slap and the calm intensity of Luca's voice, and when morning finally arrived, she woke to a message from an unknown number asking simply if she was okay, and though part of her hesitated, another part, a braver part, replied yes, and over the next few days, Luca kept his word, checking in without pressure, never pushing, sometimes sending nothing more than a short, stay safe, and Emma slowly relaxed, returning to work, reclaiming pieces of her routine, until one evening she noticed a black car parked across the street from her building, its engine off, windows dark, and her stomach dropped, old fear rushing back, but before panic could take over, Luca called, telling her calmly not to worry, that the car was his, that he'd placed it there to make sure Ryan didn't come near her again, and Emma froze, realizing this wasn't just kindness, it was influence, resources, power she didn't fully understand, and when she confronted him about it, asking who he really was, there was a pause on the line, long enough to make her think he'd hang up, but instead he told her the truth, or at least part of it, that he was involved in businesses most people preferred not to ask about, that he had enemies, and that stepping into her situation wasn't without consequences, and Emma's heart raced as she processed his words, the pieces clicking together, the suit, the authority, the way Ryan backed down, and she told Luca she didn't want trouble, that she'd already had enough chaos in her life, and Luca replied softly that trouble had a way of finding people whether they wanted it or not, but he promised her one thing, that he would never hurt her, never control her, and that if she wanted him to walk away, he would, and Emma sat in silence after the call ended, staring at the wall, realizing she stood at a crossroads, because Luca represented danger in a different form, not fists and insults, but a world she didn't know, yet he also represented safety, respect, and a chance to redefine what strength looked like, and as night fell, Emma understood that Ryan's slap hadn't just reopened old wounds, it had pushed her into a future she never planned, one where the line between fear and protection blurred, and where trusting the wrong person could cost everything, but trusting the right one might finally set her free. Emma tried to convince herself that life could return to normal, that Luca's presence was just a temporary shield until Ryan disappeared again, but normal no longer fit the shape of her days, because everywhere she went she felt the subtle weight of being watched over, not in a suffocating way, but like an invisible hand steadying her back, and it unsettled her more than she wanted to admit, especially when Luca suggested they meet for coffee a few days later, not at the same cafe but at a quieter place near the river, and she agreed before fear could talk her out of it, telling herself this was closure, not curiosity. Yet when she saw him waiting there, coat open, posture relaxed but alert, her pulse betrayed her calm, and they talked for hours about everything except the obvious, about books and music, about how Emma dreamed of opening a small art studio someday, about how Luca traveled often and preferred cities near water, and he never once tried to impress her, never raised his voice or made promises, and that restraint drew her in more than any charm could have, but beneath the easy conversation there was tension, unspoken truths pressing against the surface, until Emma finally asked him why he really stepped in that day, why her situation mattered to him when he could have looked away like everyone else, and Luca's gaze drifted to the river as he answered honestly, saying he knew what it was like to be trapped by someone who thought fear was ownership, that he'd grown up watching his mother live under that shadow, and that when he saw Ryan raise his hand, something old and furious woke up inside him, and Emma felt her chest tighten, understanding in a way words couldn't reach, and for the first time she saw not just the power in Luca, but the scars beneath it, and their connection deepened quietly after that, messages turning into calls, calls into dinners, always public, always respectful, and Emma slowly let her guard down, laughing more, sleeping better, until one evening her phone buzzed with a number she hadn't seen in weeks, Ryan's name lighting up the screen like a warning flare, and her hands shook as she declined the call, her breath shallow, because even silence from him felt like a threat, and moments later Luca called, his voice tight, asking if Ryan had reached out, and when Emma said yes, Luca told her calmly that Ryan had been asking questions, trying to find out who she was seeing, and fear coiled in her stomach as she realized the past wasn't done with her yet, and Luca insisted she stay with him for a few days, not as a demand but a precaution, and Emma hesitated, knowing that stepping into Luca's world meant stepping further from the life she knew, but the memory of the slap, the public humiliation, tipped the balance, and she packed a small bag and went with him to his penthouse overlooking the city, a place of glass and steel that felt unreal compared to her modest apartment, and though the space was luxurious, Luca made it feel safe, showing her the guest room, giving her privacy, setting boundaries, and Emma noticed how careful he was, as if he feared becoming another Ryan in her story, and that night, as city lights glittered below, Luca received a call that changed everything, his expression hardening as he listened, and when he ended the call, he told Emma the truth he'd been avoiding, that Ryan wasn't just angry, he was desperate, that he'd gotten involved with dangerous people after Emma left, and now he believed she was his way out, that hurting her might force Luca's hand in negotiations he didn't want, and Emma's blood ran cold as she realized she'd become leverage in a world she barely understood, and she told Luca she didn't want to be the reason anyone got hurt, that she'd leave, disappear again if she had to, but Luca stepped closer, not touching her, his voice firm as he told her running wouldn't stop this, that Ryan had crossed a line that couldn't be erased, and for the first time Emma saw the ruthless edge beneath Luca's control, the side of him that commanded fear, and it terrified her, yet she trusted him when he promised she would be protected, not owned, not used, and the next day proved how serious the situation had become, when a stranger approached Emma outside a grocery store, pretending to ask for directions, slipping Ryan's name into the conversation like a knife, and Emma barely made it back to the car before panic set in, and Luca's security tightened instantly, his calm cracking just enough for her to see the fury beneath, and that night, as they stood on the balcony, the city humming below, Luca told her she had a choice, to walk away now under his protection until things settled, or to stay and face the storm with him, knowing his world would never be simple, and Emma looked at him, at the man who had never raised his voice to her, who had offered safety without strings, and she realized strength wasn't about running anymore, it was about standing where fear wanted you to fall, and she told Luca she wouldn't run again, that she'd stand her ground, and in that moment, as Luca nodded slowly, respect clear in his eyes, Emma understood that whatever came next would test them both, because love, when tangled with power and danger, demanded courage neither of them could fake, and somewhere in the city, Ryan watched and waited, unaware that his next move would seal his fate and push Emma and Luca toward a future neither of them could fully control. The tension settled into Emma's life like a constant low hum, invisible but impossible to ignore, and days passed inside Luca's penthouse where time felt suspended between glass walls and guarded silence, yet Luca made a point of keeping her involved in normal things, cooking simple meals together, asking her opinion on music, letting her choose which room felt most comfortable, small gestures that reminded her she wasn't a hostage but a guest, a partner in decisions that affected her safety, and that distinction mattered more than he knew, because Emma had lived too long without choices, and still, beneath the calm routines, danger lurked, showing itself in subtle ways, like the increased number of security updates Luca took on his phone, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, and though he never lied to her, he also didn't burden her with details unless she asked, and one evening she did ask, standing by the window watching headlights blur below, asking what would happen if Ryan didn't stop, and Luca was quiet for a long moment before telling her the truth in careful words, that some people only understood consequences, and that his world was built on making sure lines weren't crossed twice, and Emma felt a chill despite the warmth of the room, realizing that Luca's restraint wasn't weakness but choice, a deliberate holding back of something far darker, and days later that darkness pressed closer when Emma insisted on returning to work for a few hours, refusing to let fear erase her independence, and Luca agreed with visible reluctance, arranging discreet protection she barely noticed, until she did notice it, when she stepped out of her office building and saw Ryan across the street, thinner, rougher, his eyes hollow with obsession, and the sight of him froze her blood, memories crashing back in an instant, but before panic could take over, Ryan didn't approach, he just stared, lifting his phone as if to record her, to prove something to someone, and Emma walked calmly to her car, heart racing, and when Luca heard, his reaction was swift and controlled, not explosive, but the air around him sharpened as he made calls, setting pieces into motion Emma couldn't see, and that night he told her Ryan had made a serious mistake by showing himself, because it meant he was desperate enough to stop hiding, and desperation made people reckless, and Emma asked if that meant things would get worse before they got better, and Luca answered honestly that it usually did, and the next morning brought proof when a message arrived on Emma's phone from an unknown number, a photo of her old apartment door, followed by a single line saying he just wanted to talk, and fear clawed up her throat, but Luca took the phone from her gently, telling her not to respond, that responding was what Ryan wanted, and Emma realized how carefully Luca thought through every move, treating emotions like currency that could be stolen if given freely, and as the hours passed, Luca finally told her what he'd decided, that he was going to end this, not violently, not publicly, but permanently, by cutting off the people Ryan depended on, isolating him until he had no leverage left, and Emma worried about the cost of that plan, about what it would do to Luca, but he met her concern with calm resolve, saying some battles had to be fought so others didn't have to live in fear, and for the first time Emma saw the full weight of leadership he carried, the burden of choosing outcomes that affected lives, and that night she couldn't sleep, pacing the penthouse while Luca worked in his study, voices murmuring through a closed door, and when he finally joined her, exhaustion lined his face, but his eyes were clear, telling her it was done, that Ryan would no longer have access to the people or resources he'd been relying on, that he'd been warned in a way he couldn't misunderstand, and Emma felt relief mixed with unease, because endings in Luca's world were never clean, and the following days were eerily quiet, no calls, no messages, no sightings, and Emma almost allowed herself to believe it was over, until a charity event Luca was hosting forced her back into the public eye, a formal evening filled with powerful people, cameras, and whispers, and Emma felt exposed despite the elegant dress Luca had chosen for her, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, grounding her without claiming her, and as they moved through the crowd, Emma noticed the way people deferred to him, the respect, the fear carefully masked as admiration, and she understood that standing beside Luca meant stepping into his world fully, whether she wanted to or not, and halfway through the night, she felt it, the shift, the sense of being watched, and when she turned, she saw Ryan at the edge of the room, uninvited but undeterred, his gaze locked on hers with a wild intensity that made her stomach twist, and before Luca could react, Ryan slipped away, leaving behind nothing but a message delivered through presence alone, and Emma's fear surged, but Luca didn't chase, didn't react publicly, instead tightening security and ending the event early, and later, in the quiet of the penthouse, Emma confronted him, asking why Ryan was still able to appear, and Luca admitted this was his final attempt, a provocation meant to pull Emma into the open, to remind her of the power he once held over her, and Emma surprised herself by laughing softly, a sound edged with defiance, telling Luca Ryan had already lost, because fear no longer owned her, and Luca looked at her then with something close to awe, realizing she wasn't the fragile woman he'd stepped in to protect, but someone who had chosen courage again and again, and as they stood together in the city's glow, Emma understood that survival had transformed her, that she was no longer reacting to Ryan's shadow but stepping into her own light, and whatever final move Ryan made next would meet not a frightened woman, but one who knew her worth, and beside her stood a man who respected it, ready to face whatever storm came next without flinching. The days following Ryan's appearance at the charity event felt deceptively calm, like the quiet before a storm everyone sensed but no one could see, and Emma found herself caught between relief and anxiety, her body still bracing for impact even as life continued smoothly on the surface, and Luca noticed the way she startled at sudden noises, the way her smile sometimes faded when she thought no one was watching, so he adjusted without announcing it, keeping plans flexible, staying closer without hovering, reminding her through actions rather than words that she wasn't alone, and one afternoon he suggested they leave the city for a short while, just a few days near the coast, a place he owned that was quiet and secure, and Emma hesitated, worried that running again would undo all the strength she'd built, but Luca explained it wasn't about hiding, it was about breathing, about giving fear less space to echo, and she agreed, discovering that trust didn't always mean standing still, sometimes it meant choosing rest, and the drive to the coast felt surreal, city tension slowly dissolving into open roads and ocean air, and when they arrived, the house was simple compared to the penthouse, warm wood and wide windows instead of steel and glass, and Emma felt something inside her unclench for the first time in weeks, and for 2 days, life felt almost normal, walks along the shore, shared meals, conversations about nothing and everything, laughter that came easily, and Emma caught herself imagining a future that wasn't defined by fear or survival, a future where she could paint again, where mornings weren't haunted by what-ifs, and Luca watched her with quiet satisfaction, not claiming that future, just standing near it, and then on the third night, the illusion shattered when Luca received a call that drained the color from his face, and though he tried to shield Emma from the details, she heard enough. Ryan had been picked up by the police for questioning related to an unrelated incident, and in desperation, he'd made statements that implicated Luca's associates, half-truths and exaggerations meant to trade information for leniency, and Emma felt a familiar guilt rise, the belief that she was the catalyst for chaos, but Luca corrected her immediately, telling her Ryan's choices were his own, that blaming herself was another way of letting him control her, and still, the situation escalated quickly, media whispers, law enforcement interest, tension rippling through Luca's world, and Emma realized this was the cost of proximity to power, that even restraint had consequences, and Luca faced them head-on, cooperating where he had to, asserting boundaries where he could, his composure unwavering, and Emma saw the man beneath the myth, someone who understood responsibility better than fear, and when Luca finally asked her what she wanted, not what felt safe but what felt true, Emma didn't answer right away, spending a sleepless night listening to waves crash against the shore, weighing the comfort of distance against the pull of connection, and by morning she knew the truth, that walking away now would be another version of fear deciding for her, and when she told Luca she wanted to stay, not because she needed protection but because she chose him, he didn't smile or celebrate, he simply nodded, eyes soft with respect, telling her that choice meant honesty going forward, no more half answers, and Emma agreed, understanding that real safety was built on truth, not illusion, and back in the city, life shifted again, more openly this time, as Luca introduced Emma not as someone to be hidden but as someone beside him, and reactions varied, curiosity, respect, envy, but none of it rattled her the way it once would have, because she wasn't there. To be validated, she was there to exist on her own terms, and Ryan, stripped of leverage and allies, faded from the center of the storm, becoming a cautionary echo rather than an active threat. And one evening, weeks later, Emma received a message from an unknown number, not threatening, not pleading, just a short apology, clumsy and incomplete, and Emma stared at it for a long time before deleting it without response, realizing closure didn't require acknowledgement, it required release. And when she told Luca, he squeezed her hand gently, proud without saying it, and life began to settle into something steadier, still complex, still demanding, but no longer ruled by fear. And Emma started painting again, filling a spare room with canvases and color, and Luca made space for it without question. And sometimes, standing there with paint on her hands, Emma thought back to the cafe, to the sound of that slap, to the moment her life fractured and reformed, and she understood now that survival had been only the first step, that choosing herself, again and again, was the real victory, and whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them not as someone owned or rescued, but as someone who stood, unafraid, beside a man who knew the difference between possession and partnership. Life didn't suddenly become simple after Ryan faded from the center of their world, but it did become clearer, and Emma learned that clarity brought its own kind of challenges, because standing beside Luca meant understanding the rhythm of his life, the constant balancing act between visibility and caution, and she chose to learn it rather than fear it, attending meetings where she stayed quiet but observant, dinners where power moved invisibly between words, and through it all Luca never treated her like an accessory, always introducing her by name, always giving her the choice to stay or leave, and that respect became the foundation she stood on, even when the past tried to reach for her again, because one afternoon, weeks after the coast trip, Emma was alone in the art supply store when she sensed someone behind her, not Ryan, but a woman she didn't recognize, well-dressed, composed, who addressed Emma by name, and before alarm could rise, the woman explained calmly that she represented people who had been affected by Ryan's reckless actions, that his desperation had cost others money and reputation, and that some believed Emma was the reason Luca had intervened so decisively. And though the woman wasn't threatening, the implication hung heavy in the air, that Emma was now a symbol, a reminder of lines crossed and consequences delivered, and Emma felt the old instinct to apologize, to make herself smaller, but she stopped, drawing a breath, and told the woman simply that Ryan's actions were his own, that she wouldn't carry responsibility for a man who chose harm, and the woman studied her for a long moment before nodding once and leaving without another word, and Emma stood there shaking, realizing strength wasn't loud, it was steady, and when she told Luca later, he listened carefully, concern flickering before settling into something like pride, telling her she'd handled it exactly right, that not every battle required his intervention, and that realization marked a shift between them, a subtle but powerful one, because Emma wasn't just protected anymore, she was trusted to stand on her own, and with that trust came growth. As she began planning her art studio seriously, researching spaces, budgets, possibilities, and Luca supported her without directing, offering resources when asked, advice when requested, never assuming control, and Emma discovered that love didn't have to feel like a cage, it could feel like open ground, and yet, even as life expanded, danger hadn't vanished completely, because one evening Luca came home quieter than usual, the lines on his face deeper, and he told Emma that law enforcement pressure from Ryan's statements hadn't disappeared entirely, that some investigations lingered, more out of obligation than substance, but they still carried risk, and Emma felt the familiar tightening in her chest, but this time she didn't panic, asking practical questions instead, what it meant, what might change, how she could help, and Luca answered honestly that patience and discretion were key, that the truth had a way of surfacing if given time, and days later that patience was tested when Luca was asked to attend a formal interview, nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory, but serious enough to cast a shadow, and Emma insisted on going with him, not into the room, but to the building, waiting nearby as a quiet show of solidarity, and Luca didn't stop her, understanding what it meant for her to choose presence over fear, and the hours passed slowly, every minute stretching, until Luca finally emerged, tired but calm, telling her it had gone as expected, that without Ryan's cooperation or credibility, the case lacked direction, and relief washed through Emma like sunlight after rain, and that night they celebrated. Quietly, not with extravagance but with takeout and laughter, appreciating peace without tempting fate, and as weeks turned into months, Emma's studio took shape, a modest space filled with light, and on opening day Luca stood in the back, watching as people admired her work, not drawing attention to himself, just there, and Emma caught his eye across the room, gratitude and love mingling in a look that needed no words, and yet, just when life seemed firmly rooted, a letter arrived addressed to Emma in unfamiliar handwriting, forwarded from her old address, and her heart stuttered as she opened it, but instead of threats, it was from Ryan, written from a treatment facility he'd been ordered into as part of a plea deal on unrelated charges, and the letter was messy, apologetic, filled with self-pity and fragments of accountability, and Emma read it once, carefully, then folded it away, understanding that forgiveness didn't require reconnection, that healing didn't mean reopening doors, and when she told Luca, he didn't tell her what to do, simply asked how she felt, and Emma answered honestly that she felt finished, and Luca smiled softly at that, because finishing was something his world rarely allowed, and as they sat together that night, the city humming beyond the windows, Emma reflected on how far she'd come, from fear in a cafe to agency in her own life, and she knew the journey wasn't over, that love with a man like Luca would always carry complexity, but it was a chosen complexity, not an imposed one, and for the first time, the future didn't feel like a threat, it felt like a canvas, wide and waiting, and Emma was finally holding the brush. By the time autumn settled over the city, painting the streets in gold and rust, Emma realized she had crossed an invisible threshold in her life, one where survival was no longer her defining trait, and that realization brought both peace and unexpected fear, because when you stop running, you are finally forced to decide where you want to stand, and Emma stood firmly in the life she had built, splitting her days between the studio, quiet evenings with Luca, and moments of stillness she once thought impossible, yet stability, she learned, did not mean stagnation, because Luca's world never stopped moving, and one morning he told her he was considering stepping back from certain operations, shifting power to people he trusted, not out of weakness but intention, and Emma understood the weight of that decision, the risks of change in a world that thrived on hierarchy and reputation, and she asked him if it was because of her, and Luca answered honestly that it wasn't because of her, but she was part of why he could imagine something different, and the truth stayed with her, not as pressure but as responsibility, because influence went both ways, and as Luca prepared for the transition, old rivals tested boundaries, subtle challenges meant to measure resolve, and Emma saw Luca navigate them with a restraint sharpened by clarity, choosing diplomacy over dominance where possible, firmness where necessary, and she admired not the power he held, but the control he exercised, and still, the past wasn't finished with her yet, because one evening, as Emma closed the studio late, she noticed a car idling across the street, engine low, lights off, and her body reacted before her mind, muscles tightening, breath shortening, but instead of panic, she paused, grounded herself, and called Luca calmly, describing what she saw without emotion, and within minutes the car pulled away, later confirmed to be nothing more than a curious onlooker drawn by Luca's proximity, but the moment mattered, because Emma realized fear no longer dictated her reactions, awareness did, and that shift was everything, and days later, Luca invited her to a gathering at a private residence, not a formal event, but a meeting of people whose approval would determine how smoothly his transition unfolded, and Emma hesitated, understanding the symbolism of her presence, but Luca made it clear the choice was hers, and she chose to go, walking into the room with quiet confidence, neither hiding nor performing, and she felt eyes assess her, measure her, but she met those looks without shrinking, answering questions honestly, speaking only when she had something to say, and when the night ended, Luca told her she had changed the room without trying, and Emma understood then that strength didn't need an introduction, it announced itself through consistency, and the following weeks confirmed it, as resistance softened, negotiations stabilized, and Luca's plans took root, and with each step forward, Emma felt their relationship evolve, not burning brighter but deeper, grounded in shared choices rather than crisis, and then, unexpectedly, closure arrived in the form of a phone call Emma never thought she'd answer, a social worker informing her that Ryan had completed his treatment program and would be relocating out of state under supervision, unlikely to cross her path again, and Emma listened calmly, thanked the woman, and ended the call without shaking, and when she told Luca, they didn't celebrate, they simply sat together in silence, honoring the end of a chapter that had shaped them both, and Emma felt something loosen inside her, not forgiveness, not anger, just release, and as winter approached, life settled into a rhythm that felt earned, the studio thriving modestly, Luca's Responsibilities lighter but no less serious, evenings filled with conversation rather than strategy, and sometimes Emma caught herself remembering the cafe, the slap, the moment everything changed, and instead of pain, she felt gratitude for the woman she had been in that moment, because she survived long enough to become who she was now. And one quiet night, standing by the window as snow began to fall, Luca asked her what she wanted next, not tomorrow or next year, but truly wanted, and Emma thought about it carefully before answering that she wanted to keep choosing her life consciously, not drifting, not reacting, but deciding, and Luca smiled, telling her that was the hardest and bravest thing anyone could do, and in that moment, Emma understood that love, real love, wasn't about rescue or possession, it was about witnessing each other's growth without fear of being left behind, and as the city slept below them, Emma felt certain that whatever future awaited, it would be faced not from the ground, but standing tall, unafraid, and finally free. The winter months passed with a quiet intensity, the kind that only comes when life settles after chaos, and Emma felt it deep in her bones, a sense of steadiness she hadn't known was possible, waking each morning not with dread but with anticipation, not of events she couldn't control, but of choices she could make, and the studio became more than a workspace, it became a sanctuary, a tangible proof of her independence and vision, where colors and shapes on canvas mirrored the freedom she now carried within herself, and Luca never interfered, never dictated, only supported when asked, offering perspective or resources without overshadowing her decisions, and Emma began to see the depth of his respect, not as a luxury, but as the foundation of the life they were building together, and in those months, their connection deepened, evolving naturally, filled with quiet understanding, playful teasing, and the rare moments of unguarded vulnerability, where Luca's armor slipped just enough for her to see the man behind the controlled presence, a man capable of both extraordinary restraint and unexpected warmth, and for Emma, it was the balance she had longed for without knowing it, and yet, even as peace settled over them, life continued to test boundaries in subtle ways, a reminder that calm was never permanent, and one evening, while Emma was preparing for a small exhibition at a local gallery, Luca received an unexpected call from a distant associate, a matter minor in content but serious in timing, and Emma watched as his face shifted from neutral to sharp focus, the kind of focus that demanded attention without demanding intrusion, and she realized that being with him meant sharing in the responsibilities and tensions of his world, even when they didn't directly affect her, and instead of fear, she felt pride, because she knew she could stand beside him and remain herself, aware yet unshaken, and the exhibition opened successfully, Emma's work drawing admiration from visitors, and Luca remained unobtrusive, a supportive presence in the background, yet his awareness of every interaction and subtle movement gave her a sense of security that was rare and profound, and afterward, as they walked home through streets glowing with winter lights, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from the fear in a crowded cafe to the autonomy she now claimed, and she understood that courage was cumulative, built by choosing herself over fear again and again, and Luca, sensing her introspection, offered his hand, a silent gesture of partnership rather than possession, and she took it, their fingers interlacing naturally, a physical acknowledgement of shared paths without ownership, and in that simple gesture, Emma felt the culmination of months of trials, choices, and growth, the blending of trust, respect, and affection into something steady and enduring, and as they entered their apartment, lights dimmed against the softly falling snow outside, Luca pulled her close, not to shield her but to share the warmth of connection, and Emma realized that strength and love were not opposites, but complementary forces, each reinforcing the other, and in the weeks that followed, life unfolded in a rhythm that was demanding yet manageable, filled with moments that tested patience, negotiation, and empathy, but also laughter, intimacy, and the rare thrill of unplanned joy, and Emma discovered that she had a voice she had never fully exercised before, not just in art or conversation, but in shaping the course of her own life, setting boundaries, and expressing desires without hesitation, and Luca, who had stepped into her life with decisiveness and control, now learned to navigate alongside her, adjusting his own rhythm to accommodate her autonomy. A subtle but significant shift that spoke volumes about the trust they had cultivated, and yet, Even in this seemingly stable world, the echoes of the past never fully disappeared, the memories of Ryan, the fear, the public humiliation, the days of running and hiding, they lingered not as chains but as reminders, shaping her choices with wisdom instead of constraint, and Emma accepted them without bitterness, understanding that past trauma could inform strength rather than diminish it, and as spring approached, she began planning a larger studio space, a place where she could teach, mentor, and expand her artistic influence, and Luca supported this vision without interference, offering resources and advice only when asked, never overshadowing her, and Emma realized that this partnership was rare, a balance of power, respect, and affection rarely seen in the worlds he inhabited, and one afternoon, while reviewing plans for the new studio, Emma received a message from an unknown number, but unlike the threatening messages of the past, this one was simple, an apology from someone connected to Ryan's circle, acknowledging mistakes, and Emma felt the old instinct to react, to doubt, to worry, but she paused, took a deep breath, and chose indifference instead, deleting the message without forwarding it, because her peace was not to be negotiated by those who had caused chaos, and when she told Luca, he didn't lecture or warn, he simply nodded, proud not of her restraint alone but of the mindset that allowed her to claim her life fully, and as they spent the evening together, sipping tea by the window, watching the city lights reflect on the river below, Emma felt an overwhelming sense of completion, not perfection, not freedom from challenges, but the rare certainty that she was standing in her own life fully, and beside her was a man who had proven that protection did not require control, that love could coexist with power without suffocation, and in that quiet moment, she understood that the slap in the cafe, the fear, the years of running, all of it had led to this, the realization that courage was not a single act, but a series of decisions, and that love, real love, was built on respect, partnership, and trust, and as the night deepened, Luca pulled her into his arms, not possessively, not urgently, but as a gesture of shared life and shared choice, and Emma rested there, finally, completely, knowing that whatever storms might come in the future, she was no longer defined by fear, that her story was her own, and that standing beside Luca, they could face anything, not as victim and protector, but as equals, as partners, and as the snow fell gently outside, blanketing the city in quiet, Emma closed her eyes, the past finally behind her, and felt a future that was open, wide, and wholly hers, and in that openness, she smiled, truly, freely, understanding at last that survival had been the first step, but living, fully and unafraid, was the victory.